one last story before we go. So the second major message of the book was that there's a physical connection between the shape of cities and urban economies, which comes through that example of sprawl. But there's another example which really shows it very well, and some of you have seen this at a city centre opening about 3 or 4 years ago, but it's a tale that I do like to tell, because I'm taking you back now to 2nd of September 1666. The fire breaks out in Thomas Ferriner's house in Pudding Lane in London. And it's a particularly troublesome fire. It'd been a dry summer. There was an unusually strong easterly wind blowing across London. And the fire occurred on a Sunday morning. The people were slow to react. By 3 a.m., one of Samuel Pepys's servants over a quarter of a mile away could see the fire. And it spread through the Thames Street area where there was tar, pitch, hemp, rosin, and flax all stored. By the end of the Sunday, the fire had burned half a mile along the River Thames. The king ordered the mayor to pull down property, making fire breaks, but this was to no avail. Streets like Cornhill and Cheapside were all jumped by the flames. Sense of desperation rose as we moved from Sunday on to Monday. The price of carts in the city rockets. People began to leave, people taking boats down the river. Duke of York replaces the bloodworth the person in control of the fire. This maybe helped to maintain civil order, but it didn't really stop many great buildings such as Dorset House, the Royal Exchange of Cornhill, Whittington's Guildhall, and other buildings from being burnt down, and of course the Cathedral of St. Paul. By the time the wind dropped on the Wednesday, 85% of the city of London was burnt to a cinder. Now, on top of all that, this fire couldn't have happened at a more troublesome time for the English. The year before, 69,000 people in London had died because of the plague. England was at war with the Netherlands, or Holland, the superior Dutch, who were joined by the French, of course. And by the end of the financial year 1667, the government revenues had fallen 25%, 30%, were down to sort of 600,000 pounds. National debt stood at £2.5 million. The cost of rebuilding after the fire was estimated at £10 million. 4 times national debt, if you can put that in today's context. We're going to rebuild something with 4 times national debt. It's a huge amount of money. And yet, within 5 years, London was rebuilt magnificently. Buildings were fronted in brick and stone. And remarkable economic effects. The economies boomed. Trading companies such as the Hudson Bay Company were formed in those few years after this fire, which you would think would just burn a place to the ground and forget it. And so London bounced back after this catastrophe in just this amazing way. And there's a number of elements to it, and again, I can't explore them all here, but one of the key things was actually the building code. So a number of 6 men were called together to come up with a new building code for rebuilding London, and they rebuilt it pretty much. The streets remained remarkably the same, to the dislike of Christopher Wren and Hooke, who was sort of the engineer surveyor on this team. But they came up with this code. Buildings had to be of a certain height depending on their location. They all had to be faced in brick and stone. They all had to have proper downspouts. There had to be paving of the streets in between. And my theory is that my interpretation, I should say, is that they created whole new industries. The industry for brick and stone must have grown. The industry for downspouts. The industry for even energy supply. The coal must have grown because the buildings were bigger. The commercial space was put underneath the residential living space above. So there's a great mixed land use that we all aspire to today. Right? So they really got it right, and they created this form that, without knowing, was just a great economic stimulus. And so that's an evidence of the physical connection with the economic growth of cities. But I move on to suggest that if you look in economic theory, other than maybe pieces from Schumpeter on creative destruction, if you want to understand how London grew back economically after a great fire, and there's been a number of fires in Chicago, St. Louis, and other US cities where they've had great economic rebounds afterwards. To understand that, I turn to the field of ecology in the last chapter and say it's a little bit like an ecosystem growing back after a fire, such as you can see here, a forest fire. And I evoke the theory of ecosystem succession, where and I describe the ecology. I'm building upon Jacobs and others and many late 18th century, 1800s philosopher Spencer, for example, and other economists, Marshall, who point to the fact that the great challenge for economists is to understand economies as biological systems, not as dynamic systems, but as biological systems. And so I develop a theory where capital is analogous to mass in ecosystems. Energy is like money flow, and there's various layers to it. But it's this idea that the ecosystems can grow through nutrients being formed by one species that then gets outgrown by the next species, and they go through these major stages of succession. And the other great example I mentioned earlier was New York City in the 1930s. How can this city that is 250,000 people out of work, there's a great recession, and yet suddenly it becomes the financial capital of America, and the world in many respects. Sorry, financial capital of the world, it already was of America. And it was then that they really started to lay out these highways and the first elements of sprawl. Maybe Los Angeles competing in some ways, but the suburban highway was developed in New York City around this time. And it's that change in the physical appearance of urbanity that really changed the New York economy. And this can only really be the metaphor, and it is a metaphor, is that it was behaving like an ecological system, like an ecosystem.